Welcome to News Nexus. I'm Emily Johnson, and today we're diving into one of the most pressing issues of our time, the global protests demanding a ceasefire in Gaza amidst the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Over the past few weeks, the world has witnessed an extraordinary outpouring of support for the people of Gaza as demonstrations erupt across continents, calling for an end to the violence and highlighting the urgent need for diplomatic action. In this video, we'll take a closer look at the global reaction, the rising toll on civilians, and what the future might hold for Gaza and the broader Middle East. Let's begin with the heart of the matter, the Gaza crisis. The Gaza Strip, home to over 2 million people, has been at the epicenter of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. Recently, however, the violence has escalated to unprecedented levels. In just a matter of days, airstrikes, ground assaults, and rocket attacks have claimed hundreds of innocent lives. The devastation is unimaginable. Entire neighborhoods flattened, hospitals and schools destroyed, and the basic infrastructure that civilians rely on, like water and power supplies, has been obliterated. The scale of the destruction has left the world reeling, and international organizations, including the United Nations, have sounded the alarm. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire, with medical supplies running low and food shortages becoming critical. The UN has called this the worst humanitarian crisis in Gaza's history, urging an immediate ceasefire to allow aid to reach those in need and to prevent further loss of life. But despite these urgent calls for peace, the violence shows no sign of slowing down. And that's where the global protests come in. From New York to Paris, from London to Cairo, people around the world are speaking out. They are taking to the streets, demanding that their governments take action to end the violence and push for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. These protests aren't just about Gaza. They're about standing up for human rights and holding leaders accountable for the lives lost in this senseless war. In Europe, the protests have been particularly powerful. In London, tens of thousands gathered outside the Israeli embassy, chanting for a ceasefire and holding signs that read, "Stop the bombing and save Gaza." Similar demonstrations have taken place in Berlin, Paris, and Barcelona, where people have called on European leaders to stop turning a blind eye to the suffering and to put pressure on Israel to halt its military operations. In the United States, protests have been organized in cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, with demonstrators demanding that President Joe Biden take a stronger stance against the violence. Many protesters are calling for a shift in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, urging the government to rethink its support for Israel and its approach to the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, protests have been growing in countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt, where large Palestinian diaspora communities feel the effects of the conflict on a deeply personal level. The cries for justice and peace are particularly loud in these nations, where there is a strong sense of solidarity with the people of Gaza. Protesters in these countries are urging Arab leaders to take a stand and call for an immediate ceasefire. What's fueling these global protests is not just outrage over the loss of life. It's a deep concern about the humanitarian toll this conflict is taking. The people on the streets are calling for immediate action to protect innocent civilians, to stop the bombings, and to ensure that humanitarian aid can flow freely into Gaza. There's a clear demand for governments to put pressure on all parties involved to negotiate a lasting peace and address the root causes of the conflict, including the plight of Palestinian refugees, the status of Jerusalem, and the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Social media has played a critical role in amplifying the voices of these protests. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok have become virtual meeting grounds where activists share images and videos of the destruction in Gaza, call for rallies, and spread awareness of the humanitarian crisis. Hashtags like Ceasefire Now, Save Gaza, and Free Palestine have been trending worldwide, giving millions of people the opportunity to make their voices heard and to demand that leaders take action. Prominent figures, including actors, musicians, and human rights activists, have joined the chorus of voices calling for an end to the violence. They're using their platforms to draw attention to the suffering in Gaza and to call for an immediate ceasefire. The outpouring of solidarity from celebrities and activists has added a new dimension to the protests, bringing even more global attention to the crisis. Despite the growing pressure, the road to peace seems uncertain. World leaders, including UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, have called for an immediate ceasefire and urged both Israel and Hamas to halt hostilities. The United Nations has even suggested sending peacekeeping forces to Gaza to help protect civilians and facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. But the question remains, will these efforts be enough to stop the violence? The protests show no signs of slowing down, and they're growing louder with every passing day. But the question still lingers. Can the global outcry lead to real diplomatic change? Can the voices of the people push governments to act? Or will we continue to witness more suffering in Gaza as the cycle of violence persists? The people protesting across the world are not just calling for an end to the violence in Gaza. They're demanding justice for the innocent lives lost. They want an end to the suffering and a future where peace is possible. They want accountability from their leaders and a commitment to long-term solutions. The ultimate goal is clear: a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that ensures the rights, dignity, and safety of all people, both Israelis and Palestinians. As the protests continue to grow, so does the pressure on world leaders to take decisive action. The question is whether they will listen. Will the global protests, fueled by solidarity and a demand for peace, finally bring about a change in the direction of the conflict? Only time will tell. But for now, the message is clear. The world is watching, and the calls for ceasefire and justice will not be ignored. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the ongoing protests over the Gaza crisis. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to News Nexus for more in-depth analysis of current events from around the globe. Until next time, stay informed and engaged.